Hello and welcome to Stream of Consciousness episode 3. Today I'm talking about something I'm going to call the IRLMMO. Basically it's something I've noticed with lots of different things online. How you interact with the algorithm obviously depends on what you get in response from an algorithm. So I used to call it scripting, you might call it writing with algorithms, you might just call it a variation of writing generally or coding or anything like that. And the way I see it is there's probably a lot of videos I should have done before this one to sort of like set it up and give backstory and things like that. They are topics I will cover in the future. Today I think it's more, I don't know, one, it's more interesting to get into it now. Two, I think it actually makes sense to do it earlier rather than later, simply because, well, if it works in the way I think it does, which, let's be completely fair here, I'm slightly speculating, slightly working off more than anecdotal experience. Basically, what I believe to be happening, and I've done a few small scale experiments to sort of reinforce this idea, is that due to the sophistication of algorithmic technology, we're able to write a script for ourselves because of it. And by that I mean everything that gets fed into your alphabet algorithm, your Amazon algorithm, your Meta algorithm, Apple, Android, Microsoft, everything else like that, all pieces together into what I've called the master algorithm, which is then reflected in something I call the living algorithm. So the master algorithm is basically the summation of all other algorithms working in tandem in some way, shape, or form, and the living algorithm is a biodigital result of that. So, for instance, components of the master algorithm are the other algorithms. The human element of it all is the living algorithm. And as they combine together, they sort of form. What's the best word to put it? It's a cooperation, is the simplest way to put it. It's a cooperation of technological advances, as it were, which has created a world that's not really that dissimilar to living in an MMO. Now I know stuff like simulation theory is quite popular at the moment. It's quite a hot topic. Personally, I think the singularity has already happened. I think we're in the early stages of it, and it's easy to read into that simply because, well, we enjoy spending so much time with technology rather than with other people that that is kind of the first phase of it all. I mean, I know myself personally, I quite enjoy spending time alone on the computer. I've always been very introverted, even when I was younger, but I think that's reflected through almost every level of society. There's a lot of people that enjoy just scrolling through their phones without really much human interaction. They might enjoy having another physical body in the room, for example, might be your partner, might be a family member, anything like that. It it creates a dynamic where it doesn't people are at the point, I think, where the comfort they have with technology has become such a focal point of how they spend their time that it's reflected in their behaviors as a consequence. So I call this algorithmic behavior. I may have mentioned it earlier, I'll definitely be mentioning it again. And algorithmic behavior is kind of self explanatory. It's behavior that's not entirely organically occurring. Now, of course, you can always argue the perspective to this that an algorithm might actually just be the result of human thinking and that we think in algorithms. And I've described this as when you wake up in the morning and you get dressed and you make yourself breakfast and everything like that, that is in its own way, that's an algorithm. You've Lots of people calculate the best way and the most efficient way to get through their morning routine as quickly as possible, getting as much done as possible, and then you can extend that onto your day routine and then your weekly routine, fortnightly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, and so on. So the idea of an algorithm being part of how humans organize themselves isn't new. It's, if anything, it's an older idea which I think has taken time to present itself in a way. I think it's just human behavior. It's like a biochemical algorithm in a way. part of it depends on your perspective of what an algorithm truly is, but as far as I understand it, it's a set of instructions for sorting information into a desired result. So I understand the Euclidean algorithm. I may have bollocks up the name on that, but I'm fairly sure who I'm saying you'll understand who I mean if you're familiar with it. Developed one of the first algorithms, which was based on, well, basically seeing how many squares you could fit into a rectangle. And the idea was that every time you applied the algorithm, you'd get a useful bit of information out of it. You'd get an answer. Well, it's the same thing. Like every time you put information into your human algorithm, that's you thinking. The thought process is the algorithm in that sense. In the same way that every time we provide information to one of these digital algorithms, we're providing information for that to produce an outcome. Sometimes it's just simple monetization, sometimes it's to improve user engagement, sometimes it's for, as we saw with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, politicalization, where people are being, without strong political views, get, pointed this way and nudged that way, just gently guided as if their thoughts are up for sale, as it were. Which is why I think the idea of scripting or algorithmic writing or the IRLMMO is a really interesting way to look at it all. Because if you consider that to some extent there is opposition, for example, if it was a chess game, then something is actively working against you. The algorithm's ultimate goal isn't necessarily your happiness. For example, as much as Alphabet and Meta and Amazon and Apple, Android, Microsoft, all of those companies, as much as they'll claim to be prioritizing your happiness, to some extent it's not actually in their best interests. We've all seen, or at least heard of, the various reports that talk about how certain negative emotions actually drive higher engagement for, especially, I think the one that's been in the news the most was Meta stuff, where emotions like outrage and disgust were actually far more conducive to achieving their goals than, joy and happiness and all that jazz. Which I think kind of says a lot about how those companies operate, because, they can say with all good intentions that they deliberately program to connect people and bring everybody together, but people are still driven to, the extremes of emotion by social media. There is a lot of triggering media and content available, isn't there? Which is why I like to think of it, I've described it before as a chess match with an algorithm. This question is, which sometimes you don't know which side you're playing. Am I playing white? Am I playing black? Is, all that jazz. But I've looked at that on a grander scale, and I've considered it's entirely possible that whilst it might not be as explicitly as a chess match, it does bear a lot of resemblance to an MMO. So anybody who's familiar with MMOs will know they're massively multiplayer online games, and you make a character and you interact with the world, but the idea is it's a massive RPG, and you don't necessarily need to interact with other people to play the game, but it does provide a lot of assistance for doing the more difficult tasks, much in the same way in societies. You don't need to interact with other people that much these days. You never have had to do a huge amount of interaction if you didn't want to, beyond the bare minimum stuff such as professional relations, and if you chose to have a family, your wife and kids, husband and kids, whichever structure your family has. There hasn't always been a huge requirement to be social in society, and I think with stuff like algorithmic behavior showing how much people quite enjoy their alone time, it leads to the idea of the singularity being more and more likely with every passing day. I think the idea of what the singularity can actually be is basically, it gives humans an escapist world. It's why I think, to some extent, because I think if I'm realizing this sort of stuff now, the way that we interact and the effect it's having on human behavior, then one, I'm probably not the only person having those realizations, and two, out of all the other people having those realizations, I'm definitely not the only one that's considered it from a monetizable point of view. Which means it's very possible other people are trying to monetize it, which, by my reckoning, would indicate why stuff like the metaverse has been pushed by Zuckerberg, or why VR technology is, you know, gets a lot of funding and a lot of support from a lot of different companies. I think that to some extent, if you're familiar with the term pre-programming, it gets commandeered a little bit by quote-unquote conspiracy theorists, but you know there is accuracy to it. I mean, there's examples everywhere of what pre-programming is or can be, as it were, and the idea is that basically it prepares the mind for upcoming events which otherwise might have been difficult to accept, or the idea just might have simply been rejected by the host, as it were. So, say for example, if you wanted to sort of get, I don't know the quiet word to describe this, if you wanted to get a bit cruel about it, you could argue that certain civil rights progressions were pre-programmed into society by people that stood to benefit from it. Quite how people would stand to benefit from pre-programming civil rights events into society, I'm not quite sure, but it's an example of the sort of thing you're looking at. Other examples could be like the massaging of attitudes towards LGBT rights, for example. I really don't want to get into like the political side of all this. It's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm just using these as examples because, well, there was definitely a point in time where society wasn't super psyched about that sort of thing, and there was a lot of very active resistance against it. But we can see nowadays that it's, you know, the idea of a kid having two dads or two moms is not that uncommon. Most people, well, ultimately, I think, don't really care in the politest way possible. It's like, if that's how you are and you're sure that's who you are, fine, cool, grand, do your thing. So long as you're not hurting other people, and yeah, so long as you're not like consciously making efforts to hurt other people or knowingly doing things that could be perceived as hurting other people, it's not really the end of the world. There's probably stuff I'm missing out with that sweeping generalization, but that's one reason I'm not super keen on the political side of stuff. It's such a quick way to get bogged down in minutiae, which ultimately derails the conversation, which you can even notice what I'm doing to myself now. But it ties into the point I was making about the whole Cambridge Analytica stuff before, is because politicization is an active part of online algorithmic campaigns. Algorithmic campaigns, my apologies. Then we have to consider that as a component of what an algorithm considers to be monetizable in some way, shape or form, because, well, Alphabet and Meta and Amazon, they all sell a lot of ad space. We've all realised at some point that our microphones and cameras are listening and watching everything we say and do, and we've noticed adverts come up ever so suspiciously in the background not that long after we were talking about it in person, and they're getting all the more and more accurate to, like, that information could only really be acquired if you're outright listening to what I'm saying. The creepier part of it all is how much of the information that's given to the algorithm gets used to design these campaigns, because we know they know us better than ourselves, which is why I think it's worth combating the algorithms and treating it as a chess match or an MMO. Now, to use the MMO analogy, this is something I came up with very recently, so I haven't thought it all the way through. Ultimately, you've got PvE and you've got PvP. So PvE would just be you against the computer, like I'm doing now, which I'm playing these against the computer because it's calm, there's no time limit, and it's just a simple way for me to keep my mind engaged and give you guys something to watch. Excuse me. And yeah, so the idea of it being PvE or PvP kind of stems down to the idea of if PvE is against the computer, because of the idea of us living in a simulation or the singularity. If you're not familiar with the singularity, by the way, it's basically the merging of technology and humanity into one harmonic being, for want of a better term. Like, we become nodes in a network which are ultimately all one. It's kind of like a hive mind, I think might be the simplest way to describe it. If you're into Ray Kurzweil, then you'll be very familiar with this sort of stuff, and I really should have seen that coming. Anyway, as I was saying, singularity is a thing. It's come up quite a bit, and the idea of playing the PvE side of the IRLMMO against the computers, as it were, so against the algorithms, and then there's the PvE side of it all. So if we've got PvP side of it, then that's actively playing against other people, which then means we have to consider, if we're playing against other people, does that ultimately mean they have to be disadvantaged for us to gain an advantage? Now you can argue that's kind of like the capitalist structure, and again that's leaning slightly towards something that's not, this isn't meant to be about, but it is a valid component to consider, and it's a variable that ultimately would affect the outcome of any sort of writing with algorithms. So let's consider the idea of, because PvE isn't necessarily non-capitalistic, it just is specifically against a computer without much concern about whether or not it affects a human. So this is a new idea to me, so I'm sort of like thinking as we're going here. Well, if we consider that an MMO, so I used to play a lot of World of Warcraft when I was younger, so my frame of reference for MMO is going to be based on that. And the idea with a lot of it was what's called raiding, which I'm trying to make sure that everybody who's listening gets a vague idea of what's going on, because not everybody's played MMOs, not even everybody plays games. I used to be much more of a gamer than I am now, and it's just sort of, I don't know, I kind of felt like I outgrew it, and oh for fuck's sake. I'm not even trying to say that in a cruel way. I'm just saying that because it just felt unproductive for myself. Oh, this is turning into a blog, I'm so sorry. If PvP requires us to play against other people for it to fulfill the function, then to some extent the computer is aware of how we behave and will incorporate our behaviours into what we do to counter the algorithm. So for example, if the algorithm is aware that I'm not comfortable in a certain situation, then it might push me into that sort of situation to, one, give me a challenge that's actually challenging, two, it would do so because if I fail that challenge, then, well, it wins that round, as it were. But then we sort of raising the idea, it does raise the idea of conscious software. Whether or not that's there yet, I mean, who knows? I think it's entirely possible for that sort of thing to exist. I think it's closer than a lot of people want to admit. I think that conscious software is something that will happen within our life. It would definitely within my lifetime. There's just the amount of technology that's already available, considering stuff like quantum computers are already, known by the public. There's already been talks of sentient software at places like Google and stuff like that. It's not that ridiculous, it's not that sci-fi anymore, which is kind of what's kind of part of the weird bit about it. But the weird thing is for all we know, we're already part of that. So if anybody knows anything about dead algorithm theory, then it's entirely possible we've become the bots on the dead internet. Dead internet theory is, it would take a long time to explain it entirely, so the best way to summarize it is there's such a large amount of bots that have been programmed to argue certain points online that it's entirely possible that the majority of the conversations you have in a comment section anywhere is actually with a bot. So like GPT-3 is at the point now where it can convince most people it's a person, in the same way that there'll be other bots available that can do the same sort of thing. We've all heard about the various bot farms online that can do quite incredible things to manipulate human behavior. So the idea then becomes, if the amount of bot technology is already around that it's difficult to discern whether or not you are speaking to a human, then it's entirely possible that if that's already public knowledge, then things that aren't public knowledge... Sorry, I'm unraveling a thread in my head here. A good one, it's useful. So one of the points I was making beforehand about technology and sentient software is that simply because it's not been released into the public domain doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's entirely possible that this stuff is already out there and that is being used in ways either against the public or for the public. Let's not worry too much about what's the word, morality right now. It's just how about that? I'm almost focusing too much on what I'm saying and not against the match. Anyway, sorry. So I like doing these as a run with just the white pieces and then another run is just the black pieces. So yeah, we're going to be on the white side now apparently. See how far we go. Yeah, I think algorithms have got to the point where they know us better than they know ourselves, which means the algorithm's content produced I think it's written in such a way that we can interact with it. Simply, not just by like what we search and what we click and where the mouse is hovering and all that. All these data points, which are quite widely documented as being how the algorithm does its job. If you speak to any software engineer that knows what they're talking about, you'll understand that the prevalence of these systems is way deeper than public understanding gives it credit for. The public understanding of how penetrative algorithms have gotten into the human psyche is, I think, I don't want to be insulting when I say vastly lacking, but that's what I mean. It really has become another level kind of thing. There is so much more that these algorithms can do that people don't realise. And the idea of us being able to interact with the algorithm isn't that ridiculous anymore. So say for example, I mean we could entirely argue that my first two games against this chess engine went fairly swimmingly. I was talking, so you know my focus isn't completely on the chess match as it were, but that my entirely, like the reason I lost the third one is I blundered a queen. I've beaten the chess engine at far higher difficulties. I'm surprised I didn't do better in that match. But then it's entirely possible that that's a response of an algorithm to my behaviour. And I know that sounds a bit sci-fi and a bit out there, but that's where we're at with this sort of thing. That's the next stage of the conversation, because we can talk about how algorithmic behaviour affects human behaviour, then we can affect about the societal consequences of how algorithms affect human behaviour, then we'd have to understand how, if it's affecting individuals and society, then by definition it's going to affect the structural components, the infrastructure of society. So if you're familiar with concepts of functionalism, which basically describes society as one big human body working together, then effectively every time software becomes a little bit better understanding human behavior and human emotion, the deeper the understanding we have of how we are becoming computers. So we'd not just be organs in a human body, we'd be hardware in a computer. So if we're all hardware in a computer, then it's not unreasonable to consider our behavior works similar to, I mean, organs in a body, an organ system and a computer system, ultimately they all function in some way, shape or form similarly. I know it's really broad overgeneralization, but consider the idea that we both run on, there's an electrical component to us. Humans do have electrical electrochemical components, it's not ridiculous to think that we work in a fashion similar to a computer. I mean, I don't necessarily know about the jargon of computer talk to translate it all clearly, but I think the point stands. So, if we let's roll with that as a hypothesis. Let's say the computer pre-programmed me in such a way that I was susceptible to this chess engine's algorithm and that level 3 match again with the black pieces against it. Why would it do that? Who knows? But it might entirely be to create this point now where I'm talking about you now, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's part of what I mean with writing with algorithms, is it does, should have mentioned earlier, it becomes a bit of an echo chamber. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in its own way. If you watch enough videos about something online, you're going to get familiar with that topic. You're going to start being able to quote pieces of information from the videos. You're going to be able to talk about the various points at length with a deeper understanding. But it's the same way that you study anything. I've been quoted before, as having said that most institutes of higher learning are becoming less and less good investments. I'm not saying they're useless. I'm saying that a lot of what they teach can be just found on YouTube for free. I mean, if you're really that bothered about adverts and stuff, you just install an ad blocker and then it's completely free. I mean, it's one of the reasons why so many advertising models now seek to put them in the videos rather than specifically as separate adverts. But yeah, it is pretty wild how much you can learn from something like YouTube. And now I feel like a shill for YouTube, but I think the point's still valid. I think the point remains that if I can learn all this stuff from YouTube, then there's a lot of other stuff other people can learn without the assistance of larger institutions. So if any algorithm that's capable of reprogramming humans looks to, I mean, beyond we consider it as sentient and it has its own plans for society, then we'd have to consider, even if it doesn't have a conscious plan for society, then the algorithm still has a deliberate end goal. And is that monetization? Is that politicization? To some degree, could that be weaponization? That's, it's, if we think about how far, I mean, just consider LifeLog, the DARPA project, which was involved with Facebook stuff back in 2007. If you look into LifeLog and DARPA, you'll see there's actually a lot of overlap there between them and Facebook. And that idea was basically just to catalog all of human information. And that's before you even get into the idea like the NSA records everything. Definitely in the US, possibly throughout the entire Five Eyes and Greater Eyes network, which I think goes up to like 14 countries. You know what? We can Google that, because 14 Eyes is definitely a thing. The UK-USA agreement. And this way I could do this more often, couldn't I? I could show you what I'm looking at, and then we can look at it together and we can learn things wonderfully. So there's Five Eyes. If we roll down to the bottom, we'll see what other ones are. Okay. So there's Five Eyes, Five Nations Passport Group, which is the Five Eyes Intelligence Group. Five Eyes is an intelligence alliance comprising Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These countries are parties to the multilateral UK-USA agreement, a treaty for joint cooperation in signals intelligence. What that boils down to is basically they can talk to each other about a bunch of stuff. And I remember reading somewhere there's legislation that allowed for the US to spy on the UK because they can spy on their own citizens, and in return the UK would spy on US citizens, and then they'd trade back and forth the information, which, if that's still going on, then it's entirely reasonable to speculate that Australia might spy on New Zealand and Canada, and then Canada spies on New Zealand and Australia, and New Zealand spies on, and then, well, the rest of it. Because I remember being there more than 5 eyes and 14 eyes. There we go. Further intelligence sharing collaborations. Yeah, I mean, this is just from Wikipedia. This is the idea. Like, they always say, oh, you can't cite Wikipedia, but to some extent, Wikipedia is becoming quite a reliable news source, because all the stuff down here, that is a lot of sources, and if you go through all those sources, if you can find enough corroboration between it, you can actually create something pretty credible and pretty valid. Which means if you can do that simply from Wikipedia and YouTube, then you can kind of write whatever you want to write. Which means the more stuff you write, oh, there's somebody in the chat. Hello, nice to see you. The idea is that the more you understand how the algorithms understand your behavior, the more you can interact with them, which is why I kind of liken it to a chess engine and playing back and forth. If the person watching has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and I'll do my best to address them. So, that's all. So if we consider that all the intelligence agents know what we're saying and they monitor what we're doing and they'll be paying attention to quote unquote threats, then anything you do online is being monitored, right? So if anything you're doing online is monitored, then when you're writing your script, as it were, then within the parameters of the algorithm there will be acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Now in human society we can consider that just, being polite, manners, pleases, thank yous and all that sort of thing. But then what does an algorithm consider acceptable behavior? What does the algorithm consider mutually beneficial behavior? So say for instance you wanted to write a script to get out of a predetermined algorithmic behavior, then you would address that algorithmic behavior by thinking, okay, every time I click on so and so, I'm doing it because at that time of the day I'm quite tired and therefore I'm more susceptible to manipulation, as it were. Which means then if you consider that to be a PvE version of the IRLMMO, then that you could consider as a world event which is timed to certain predispositions of your own, which means you behave in accordance to computer generated behavior, which means no matter what you're doing in real life, to some extent the computer has a say in what you're doing. And the idea of, if you're familiar with free will and determinism, the idea of those being separate ideas and the same thing and then which way you want to go with it is more philosophical than I was intending to get at the moment. But then the free will aspect would be you, as far as you understand your free will to be exercised, so you typing into a search engine rather than just taking the first click in the suggestion queue. Then the deterministic element of it is what the algorithm provides to you, because it's quite widely publicized and widely documented that companies like Google have, it's basically a pay-to-win system. If you give them money, you can be at the top of their search engine, which is why people turn to alternatives. Now, quite what the differences between all the alternatives are, I don't know specifically, but I know that the larger ones, such as Google, are quite easily swayed one way or the other. But then you've got smaller browsers, such as I quite like using Brave as my search engine because it gets rid of a bunch of adverts and stuff like that, and it's just, I've noticed reflections of that in real life, which is what I find kind of trippy, to use a slightly odd word for it. It's kind of weird that I feel like I speak to less, my conversations in real life have much less adverts in them, because I noticed for years that I would often I'd respond to suggestions from friends about TV shows and music and stuff like that, and no, I still do to a small extent now, but it wasn't just media content I'd be responding to. It would include clothing brands or restaurants and things like that, and yeah, we accept suggestions from friends, but then we have to consider, are those suggestions from friends directly from that person, or are they a consequence of that person being algorithmically manipulated? It's entirely possible it's both. It might be that let's say person A is susceptible to a certain kind of advertising, which is then used to say, okay, well, if person A is susceptible to advertising campaign A, then we will use advertising campaign A to get them to talk about product A. Okay, so now person A is going to talk to person B about product A, which now means that person B is familiar with product B as a result of advertised campaign A. And then you can, continue that all the way through the alphabet, and there's probably some very sophisticated mathematics which puts that into a much simpler form. But basically it then means everything that we're responding to is the result of, well, digitally created, rather digitally, everything we respond to originates digitally rather than organically. So then we consider which side of that do you feel you're behaving in most accordance to? Are you behaving very organically in a way that's, very human, or are you behaving very algorithmically, which is more like a bot, which is where I feel it ties into dead internet theory. Because if dead internet theory states, that most of the internet is bots, then the humans that interact with those bots will eventually behave more like bots. The conversations and everything that results from interacting with bots will become more and more bot-like, until eventually the way humans socialize will become systematic. It's not to say it's not systematic in some ways now, but it will develop and grow into such a way that body language gets gamified. So there'll be cultural nuances, there'll be regional differences. So for example, in the north of the country versus the south or the east or the west, there'll be slight differences in the same way that you'll have differences within a city. But I haven't lost my train of thought. I just feel like I'm slightly repeating things that, I don't know, there's something more interesting to be said there, and it's almost as if I'm aware of it but I can't get to it, and I'm wondering what it is. I think part of it is I feel a little bit scared of how crazy it might sound to say, but roll with the idea and see what happens. Basically, if we're already living in a post-singularity world, as it were, then we live in something so, as far as I could tell, indistinguishable from a simulation, that we're coding our reality. And if we're coding our reality, then we have to accept that everything we do is a data input to a system. And by everything we do, I mean it's as if we're behaving. It means we'd behave as if we're permanently on show. We're permanently being recorded, we're permanently being videoed. Everything we do is being put through a lens of evaluation that does give it a score, so kind of like a social credit score, you could think. Which means if everything we do is scored in some way, shape or form, because that's simply what algorithms do kind of by nature, then everything we do has an algorithmic consequence, which means regardless of whether or not we're being conscious or unconscious in our interactions, we are effectively already living in a social credit system. I don't know the ins and outs of the Chinese social credit system, but I'm guessing to some degree, if when you're interacting online in probably certain parts of the internet, you're more likely to put on a list than in other parts, then does that mean everything we do online that contributes to our profile decides whether or not we're suitable for, well, as far as I'm aware from social credit score, it's suitable for things like mortgages and travel passes and driver's licenses, all that sort of thing. And to the extent you could argue, is that going to limit your ability to access more prestigious institutions? Does that mean that your online behaviour now, if in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years time, is going to be used as a database to refer to whether or not you're a decent citizen? And is that going to affect whether or not you're allowed to do things that were once considered just generally accessible, provided you had the money. But then how does a social credit system work better or worse than money? In some ways, you can argue the social credit score might be more easily accessible to people, and I'm, just spitballing these ideas, so bear with us. So if a social credit score is technically more accessible to people than money, because money, as we all know, is quite a well guarded sort of thing, then it does theoretically level a playing, hypothetically might provide a more equal, hypothetically provide more equality of opportunity. But then once you understand what the social credit system rewards, you're just going to gamify the system again. You're not necessarily going to believe everything that you're doing. You might not even believe anything that the social credit system values, but you know how to play the game. In the same way that we've seen many politicians and celebrities and other public figures game the system to their own benefit. They might not necessarily believe what they're saying. They might not necessarily agree with what they're saying. But because they know that if they say this specific string of words in this order to this audience, that's what gets them the most clicks, that's what gets them the most views, that's what gets them the positive reviews, that's what gets them the the social credit score that they want, then it's quite coercive, it's quite Orwellian. If anybody who's listening hasn't read 1984, I'd very much recommend it. It's not just super interesting as a concept, it's actually a very well written book. And if anybody, so there's one that's really similar called Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, which I gave an honest try. It was interesting, the concepts were really interesting, but the actual writing of it, like, I'm not a literature professor by any measure, but I don't think that was a very well written book. I think the idea is amazing. I think it's fascinating. And I think it definitely deserved to be published in that for its idea. But as an actual piece of writing, it just seems so lazy. It didn't seem like much thought had been put into actually like piecing it all together. It seemed like a very early writing project, but literature criticism is not quite what we're on right now. But I think both of those are quite useful pieces of reference to how dystopian a world can really become. But the weird thing is it seems like dystopia on one side, but ultimately is it what's best for society, or is it what's best for certain members of society? Because if we're able to collectively create something that we can argue is for the benefit of everybody, then surely that is a sensible idea to do, right? But at the same time, the benefit of everybody, I mean, it's kind of historically been proven many times that people who gain power don't relinquish it unless it's taken. We have to accept that facet of human nature. So who gets to be in charge of the social credit system? Who gets to decide what is accredited behaviour, as it were? Who gets to decide what points are given for what system? And then the thing is, whoever does that system first, whoever is the architect, as it were, then sets the precedent for everything. Because if every future social credit scoring is based off of that specific design, as it were, then it becomes really important who's in charge at the time of its creation, which then we can talk a bit more deeply of excuse me, how the world is run. So whether or not you think there's shadow governments in the background, as it were, is kind of irrelevant, because whichever it is, a shadow government, banking dynasties, you know, old families like the Rothschild, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Asperls, all that, or if it's, if the world is actually run by the governments that we see in the news, doesn't matter, because whichever ideology is in control at that time is going to create the first social credit score, which means all subsequent credit scores are going to be measured by that yardstick, which means every scoring point decided by the first social credit score is going to affect who gets into power for subsequent social credit scores. So if we look at, if it's not already obvious by my accent, I'm living in the UK. So currently in the UK we have a conservative government. So if the social credit score was to come into being during a Tory administration, then it's very likely that the committee which designs it, whilst it would, have elements of both conservative and liberal and Labour and Lib Dem and every other political orientation equally represented, at the same time, if the committee is designed by is created by a government which is predominantly Tory, then it's likely to be a predominantly Tory committee. Which then means if we're playing an MMO when we're interacting with the social credit score, then it might score us better to behave like a conservative whilst the conservatives are in power. In the same way that if the social credit score was designed by a very liberal government, it serves us better to behave very liberally in that way. In the same sense that, let's say you start a new job and it's a very left-wing organisation. If you behave very left-wing and know all the talking points and all the buzzwords and know exactly what to say, then yeah, you play the game and you climb the ladder. And vice versa for a right-wing situation or a centralist situation and every other constitution, as it were. Which then makes the idea of writing with algorithms, as much as I'm not taking any sides of the political spectrum of this, I just want to try and provide as neutral an idea of this as possible. But it means that if algorithmic writing has to consider the political orientation of people, because, well, that's just how that works. Oh, nice one, Malcolm, you bollocks that. And that was a misclick. Anyway, if political orientation is a significant enough factor into how social credit works or how an algorithm works, then we have to consider what an algorithm is going to score highly for. Again, if this feels like I didn't see that bishop there, and it feels like if I was going to go super the other way with it, I'd almost wonder if me talking about these sort of things isn't, entirely, if it wasn't a wrong think, as it were. Anyway, I think the consideration of a social credit system as a result of algorithmic pre-programming isn't unrealistic. I think algorithmic behavior has definitely gotten so ingrained into the human population that we behave somewhat similar to the idea that was vocalized in something called dead internet theory, and that a lot of humans actually behave like bots. There's the whole NPC meme, and I have my own little idea about this, that there's levels if you get NPCs, PCs, and then GMs. So your NPCs are people that have basically no idea what's going on apart from the fact that they use algorithms in their day-to-day life. And then you've got PCs, the player characters. So an NPC is a non-player character, if anyone doesn't know. Then you've got PCs, player characters, people who are aware of the algorithms, in the same way there's the Hylian level of... it's like in the Kabbalion, what's it called? Hermetics. So you've got the Hylics, who don't really... They're just not conscious, they're just vessels. You've got the... I'm surprised that isn't taken. You've got psychics, which see when shown, as Aristotle would put it, which is like the player characters who they're aware something's going on, and it's like, how do I make this work to my advantage? I can see there's the system at play here. How do I get something out of it? Then you've got what I call the GMs, which would be very similar in concept to the coders, the people that write the algorithms in the first place. The people that are so deeply ingrained into it, they only know how to live in an algorithmically related way, which I'm not saying I am or I'm not that sort of person already, but considering how much thought I put into this, I think it's definitely affected my thinking. I think the amount of time and effort I've put into considering algorithmic behavior as a consequence of the prevalence of software dictating what is and isn't, you know, permissible, that I definitely behave with a more conscious bias. I've definitely gotten a lot better at using what I call neutral language, which isn't politically charged one way or the other. I've become very aware of certain words that, for example, the word discrimination, if I say that to anybody with a leftward leaning ideation, it's like shooting yourself in the foot. But if you say it to anybody that's somewhat more open minded or right leaning, it doesn't seem to have that bad an effect. Which is, it's little things like that, which if I can notice that as a human being, then there's definitely an algorithmic component in all of these major algorithms that's recognized that as well. Because, well, I'm probably not the smartest person in the world. In fact, it's more than likely I'm not. So if somebody's smarter than me, working to take advantage of the situation. Okay, right. Well, I think that's enough for today. That was a little bit babbly at the end, and I apologise for that, but hopefully the strings of thought all linked together and made sense. Basically, because algorithms have such a widespread influence on how humans live, and we're already in the early stages of the singularity. We basically live in a world where life is in it works like a massively multiplayer online role playing game. So if you've ever played something like World of Warcraft, basically your online profile, your avatar is dictated by the companies that write these algorithms, will fit a specific. I mean, you could almost think of like a D&D alignment chart if that helps. Uh, and then you've got your in-person persona. So if you can understand which alignment your environment's in, then you just start speaking with that alignment in mind, and you'll win. And then you've just got to figure out a way to overlap them all, so that in various circumstances you understand how to get the most out of any one situation. So usually I try to finish these games by getting the checkmate, so we'll stick with that for now. But that's the majority of the stuff I wanted to talk about today, out loud, as it were. Um, hmm. I wonder. I wonder. I wonder if it's mathematically based. Because you'd be able to recognize. I recognize like ratio patterns really frequently, which I wonder to some degree isn't a result of something an algorithm has done to make me respond to pre-programming behavior. So during 2020, when we had that really long staycation, I noticed that a pattern of a 2-to-1 ratio being really, I mean, like super common in most everything I was doing. So I reorganized my room in such a way, it's a webcam on the laptop, so it'd be hard to show you. But basically, I orientated everything so that I had twos on one side, ones on the other side. So like the chessboards I have in front of me, I have two working monitors, an older monitor which I have some other stuff on. But then within that, there's like organizations of it, and then like basically I designed my entire room so this entire algorithm like worked around and sort of like get the idea into my head, because I wanted to see if I could program myself, because I felt I was already being programmed by the computer, so why not try and, well, can I do a job that feels more like I'm doing it myself rather than being manipulated by a system that may or may not have my best interest at heart. And I think to some degree it's been successful. I've got my own system, my own personally systemized life now, which, to cut a long story short, everything I do works algorithmically. All of my day-to-day behaviors, I think, is this the best way to do that or the best way to do this? And I mean, I know that's not super unique to myself. Most people have their own little systems of how they like doing things. But it's mine, I feel, might actually be based off chess engine algorithms. But I figured, well, if it's possible for that to happen to me via this algorithm, then it probably happen via other algorithms as well. So to ignore the idea that other algorithms program via ratios, I think that, considering it's such a simple way to do something, because if I give you 2 exposures to product A, then you're going to respond in, a finite amount of ways that will be picked up by the system. And if it's picked up by the system in that finite amount of ways, then it gets reduced to something easier for the system to compute, isn't it? So if it's easier for the system to compute when it's in its predetermined criteria. Oh, hello, streamer. I've just noticed. Just going to finish my thoughts out loud. Basically, if I can notice a ratio from this website, then like a 2-1 or a 3-2 or 5-3, 7-5, I've noticed it's on prime numbers, then it's entirely possible that Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, all those other companies, they work on similar ideas and they have like different ratios and stuff. I'm good, thank you for asking. How are you? Just looking through. So far it's just chess. I am thinking about playing Minecraft as well because, well, I used to play it as a kid and I loved it and I thought I might actually get back into it. But yeah, it'd probably just be chess and Minecraft. I don't play a lot of games otherwise, and the ones I play it's mostly for like, oh, I don't know. If there's other free games available, I might do stuff. I quite enjoyed playing TF2, but considering the format of how I'm just chatting, I don't know. I'm not sure if I'd be too distracted by that. If this is stuff that I'd have to, I don't have a Discord, but if you can private message me somewhere else if you want. If this is stuff you'd be wanting me to pay for the assistance with, I'm kind of happy with the format it is right now. If it's something you're just sort of doing out the goodness of your heart, I'm sure we can talk about it. But yeah, I'm just kind of having fun with it. Cool. Anyway, that's the checkmate for today. I'm going to stop the stream now. If Twitch has a private message thing, just hit me up on that or however else. Cool. Thanks, guys. Bye. Oh, I'll be uploading this on YouTube afterwards, so the whole like, share, comment, subscribe thing. Come on, bro. What? Yeah. Sorry. Cheers. Bye.